So for example, it's clearly the case that when a child is socialized, there's pros and cons to that. The pros are the socialization turns the little beastly 2-year-old into a 4-year-old that other children can play with. And that does happen between the ages of 2 and 4 if a child is socialized properly. And then what the child does is kind of turn into a clone of everyone else so that he or she can benefit from being able to interact with everyone else. Now that builds up a certain amount of individuality because kids learn to talk and they learn to play and all that. And it destroys a certain amount of individuality. So everybody sacrifices a certain portion of their peculiarity to become a socialized creature. And some of that's good and some of it's bad. And we know that. That's the standard story of the rebellious adolescent against society for crushing their individuality, right? And there's an element of that that's true. But by the same token, if you don't sacrifice a certain amount of your individuality to the group, there's no such thing as society. Everybody has to live on their own. Everyone is in their own subjective bubble, which is of course now required by this law. And society itself breaks down. And so you can't have a society without marginalizing people, or you can't have a society without making everyone, part of everyone, marginalized. And so then when you start to concentrate on the marginalized, it just grows and expands and grows and expands and grows and expands until everyone becomes marginalized.
And that just highlights a real problem with quote mining. That someone is going to take that, you can't have a society without marginalizing people, quote, and put it under Dr. Jordan Peterson, this is what he believes.
Right, well, that's actually what Jacques Derrida said, the most famous of the postmodernists. That's why Derrida is such a invasive force. He said, well, you can't have a society without marginalizing. It's like, well, that's true. It's true, comma, but, ... right? But the fact that you can't have a society without marginalizing doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a society. And it doesn't mean that the only reason that society exists is to marginalize. And that was Derrida's claim. That's what makes him so... He's absolutely pathological to the core, Jacques Derrida. And apart from his claims that all we do is trade power games, because that's another one of his claims, his other claim is that the purpose of categorization, the purpose of society is to marginalize. And that's absolutely absurd. The purpose is so that we can all play a moderately mediocre but productive, homogeneous social game. Is it perfect? Well, obviously not. Does it require the sacrifice of individuality? Yes. Is some of that sacrificed individuality valuable? Absolutely. What's the alternative? No society. Well, I don't think so. That doesn't seem like a very good alternative to me. Or maybe some sort of egalitarian utopia. Well, yeah, we had 100 years of that, and 100 million deaths as a consequence. And so maybe not that either. What we have right now is a flawed system. But it's the best flawed system that anybody's ever come up with. And of course it marginalizes people. How could it not? It's if kids organize themselves in a playground to play hide and go seek, they've marginalized all the kids that wanted to play tag. Obviously. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't come to a consensus and go ahead and play a game. At least they're bloody well playing a game that pretty much everybody has access to.
I think marginalized is a lot of times associated with oppression. That term marginalized, and it's not necessarily the case. And I think that society as a whole and civilization is sort of a work in progress. We're working all this out. And that's one of the beautiful things about you being able to discuss these things on your YouTube page, as opposed to just having to battle it out inside the echo chamber of the universities. You're able to express this stuff out in the world where people like me that are 49 years old that aren't in college have a chance to read this and see like, wow, what is this guy going through over there at the University of Toronto? And then you start to examine the laws and you start to look at what's going on here. And this egalitarian utopia idea, it's beautiful in its concept that we should all be able to get along and everything should be equal. The problem is it defies human nature. It defies the 200, 300,000 years of DNA that we have bouncing around inside of our bodies that demand certain types of behavior. And I think it's so important that we discuss these things. And I think that society and civilization as a whole, this thing that is ultimately in this growing state, this constant state of improvement and objective interaction, I mean, there has to be some sort of discussion. One of the problems that I have with the so-called social justice warriors and with this movement is that they're enforcing a certain type of thinking and behavior, and they're incredibly aggressive about it, hence the warrior term.
Yeah, well, I think a fair bit of that is grounded again in temperament, which is quite comical. I mean, one of the things that our research on political correctness indicated that this trait, agreeableness, is a good predictor of holding politically correct views, and also that being female is a good predictor of holding politically correct views. And I think part of the reason for that, and the warrior aspect to it too, is that agreeableness is a maternal instinct trait, roughly speaking. And human beings have very powerful maternal instincts. That's true for women and for men, because men are very involved. Male human beings are very involved in the raising of their children, which makes them quite different than many large animals. On the one hand, if you're very maternal, you're very compassionate and protective of those that are within your kin boundary. And you can try to include more people in that if you want. And that's the political goal. But you're unbelievably hostile to anyone who's outside of that you regard as a threat/predator. And so agreeableness makes you divide the world up into protected children and predators.
And you see that on social justice warriors' Twitter pages. I mean, I follow a bunch of them, and I go to them and I watch this, incredibly supportive, to ridiculously so, in terms of like mediocre expressions, tweets that, oh my God, it's so brilliant, and it's like you're saying almost nothing.
Yeah.
And they're so incredibly supportive of the people that think along their lines, and so incredibly hostile, and this idea of shaming people that don't agree with them, not interacting with them, but almost immediately insulting them, almost immediately marginalizing them, which is ironic. This is what you see constantly, is like super supportive and super aggressive against people that have any sort of an opposing viewpoint.
Yeah, well, they're all predators, the ones that have an opposing viewpoint.
And that's how they define them.
It's one of the things that's very comical about this, from my perspective, is that it's such sex stereotypical behavior, is that at the same time that the social justice warriors are denouncing the idea that psychology, for example, might have anything to do with sex differences, they're acting out sex stereotype behavior like mad in terms of their persecution of predators and their protection of the kin/in group. So